There's a number that quietly determines whether your retirement savings last 30 years or 10. It's called the 4% rule. And once you understand it, you'll never look at your savings account the same way again. Most people either overspend in retirement out of fear of missing out or underspend out of fear of running out, both without ever knowing the actual number that tells them what's safe. Today, I'm handing you that number. Here's what the rule says, in plain language. If you withdraw about 4% of your total retirement savings in your first year of retirement and adjust that amount slightly for inflation each year after, your savings should reasonably last around 30 years for most typical market conditions. So if you have $500,000 saved, the rule suggests you could withdraw roughly $20,000 in your first year, then adjust that upward slightly each year to keep pace with rising costs. To apply it to yourself, take your total retirement savings, multiply by 0.04. That's a reasonable starting point for your first year of withdrawals. It's not a perfect science. Think of it as a compass, not a GPS. It gives you direction, not an exact guaranteed outcome. Here's where it can go wrong. The rule was built on historical market averages, but markets don't move in straight lines. If a market downturn hits early in your retirement, withdrawing a fixed percentage from a shrinking pool can do more damage than the same percentage withdrawn later. This is called sequence of returns risk, and it's a real limitation of a simple percentage rule. Let's actually see this play out, because sequence of returns risk sounds abstract until you watch two nearly identical retirements produce very different results. Picture two retirees. I'll call them Ellen and Marcus. Both retire with exactly $600,000. Both withdraw 4% in year one, $24,000, and adjust it slightly upward for inflation every year after, exactly as the rule describes. The only difference, the order in which their investment returns arrive. Ellen retires right before a rough 2 years in the market. Her portfolio drops by roughly 15% combined over her first 2 years of retirement, before recovering to its long-term average afterward. Marcus retires with the exact same average return over his lifetime, but his rough 2 years happen much later, in years 14 and 15, after his portfolio has already grown for over a decade. Here's the uncomfortable part. Even though both retirees experienced the exact same average return over the full 30 years, Ellen's retirement is meaningfully more fragile. Because she was withdrawing a fixed dollar amount from a portfolio that dropped early, she was forced to sell more of her investments while prices were down, locking in losses that a portfolio without withdrawals wouldn't have locked in. Marcus, withdrawing from a portfolio that had already grown for years before his downturn hit, had a much larger cushion absorbing the same dip. Same average return, same withdrawal rule. Very different outcomes, purely because of timing neither of them could control. This is exactly why flexibility matters more than the rule itself. Retirees like Ellen who build in the ability to slightly reduce spending during a rough early stretch, skipping the inflation adjustment for a year or two, for instance, dramatically improve their odds, compared to those who withdraw the same fixed, rising amount no matter what the market is doing. So how do you actually build in that flexibility in practice, rather than just hoping you'll remember to cut back if things get rough? One common approach worth understanding is what's sometimes called the bucket strategy. Instead of holding all your retirement savings in one mixed pool and pulling 4% out of it every year regardless of what the market is doing, you split your savings into 3 buckets with 3 different jobs. The first bucket holds 1 to 2 years of living expenses in cash or cash equivalents, safe, stable, and untouched by market swings. The second bucket holds a moderate mix of bonds and conservative investments, meant to refill the cash bucket every year or two under normal conditions. The third bucket holds your longer-term growth investments, stocks, which you're not planning to touch for at least 7 to 10 years, giving them time to recover from any downturn along the way. Here's why this matters for Ellen's situation specifically. If a downturn hits in her first 2 years of retirement, she isn't forced to sell shrinking stock investments to cover living expenses. She simply draws from the cash bucket, which isn't affected by the dip at all, and lets the growth bucket sit untouched until it is time to recover. Marcus, in a normal market environment, simply refills his cash bucket each year from the other 2, business as usual. Let's put a number on what this is actually worth. If Ellen's cash bucket holds 2 years of her $24,000 starting withdrawal, $48,000, that's often enough runway to ride out a typical 2-year downturn without ever selling a single depressed stock investment. That $48,000, held safely aside from day one, is frequently the entire difference between a retirement that recovers smoothly and one that never fully does. None of this requires predicting when the next downturn will hit. Nobody can do that reliably. It just requires making sure that whenever it does hit, you're not forced to sell your most volatile investments at the worst possible moment. That single structural decision, made once, does more for your retirement's resilience than almost any other adjustment available to you. The rule also doesn't know your personal healthcare situation, your family circumstances, or how long you'll actually live. All things we've talked about in earlier videos. There's one more refinement worth knowing, because it answers the question a lot of you are probably already asking. Okay, but when exactly should I adjust my spending, and by how much? Some financial planners use what's called a guardrails approach. Instead of one fixed percentage, you set an upper and lower guardrail around your original withdrawal rate. If your portfolio performs unusually well and your withdrawal rate, the percentage you're actually taking out relative to your current balance, drifts below a lower guardrail, say 3%, that's a signal you likely have room to modestly increase spending. If a downturn pushes your withdrawal rate above an upper guardrail, say 5%, that's a signal to modestly cut back, usually by pausing that year's inflation adjustment rather than cutting your base spending entirely. Let's make this concrete. Say you retire with $500,000, withdrawing $20,000 in year one, exactly 4%. 3 years later, a strong market has grown your portfolio to $560,000, while your withdrawal has only grown modestly with inflation to $21,000. Divide $21,000 by $560,000, and your current withdrawal rate has actually drifted down to about 3.75%, comfortably within a normal range. And if it dropped further toward 3%, that's a reasonable, evidence-based signal that an extra trip or a bit more generosity toward family might be genuinely affordable, not just wishful thinking. Now flip it. Say instead a downturn drops that same portfolio to $420,000, while your withdrawal has still grown to $21,000 for inflation. Divide $21,000 by $420,000, and your withdrawal rate has jumped to exactly 5%, hitting the upper guardrail. That's the signal to pause the inflation adjustment for a year or two, rather than waiting until the portfolio has dropped much further before responding. The appeal of this approach is that it replaces vague anxiety. Should I be worried about my spending? With one simple annual calculation, this year's withdrawal divided by this year's balance. That single number tells you, with real evidence rather than a feeling, whether you're in a comfortable zone, a cautious zone, or a zone that calls for a small adjustment. It turns, "I hope this is fine," into, "I checked, and here's exactly where I stand." So use the 4% rule as your starting conversation, not your final answer. Bring it to a financial advisor. Layer it against your own retirement number and your own timeline. Adjust it down slightly if you're planning for a longer retirement, or if you don't have other income sources like a pension to lean on. So use the 4% rule as your starting conversation, not your final answer. Bring it to a financial advisor. Layer it against your own retirement number and your own timeline. Adjust it down slightly if you're planning for a longer retirement, or if you don't have other income sources like a pension to lean on. Knowing this number doesn't mean spending recklessly or living in fear. It means spending with intention, the kind of intention that lets you enjoy this chapter without constantly looking over your shoulder. If this helped make sense of a confusing rule, subscribe. We're covering the retirement expense almost nobody plans for next. I'll see you in the next one.